Hey, and hello everyone. Welcome to almost perfect launch of another ComicBase live stream. I believe, is this number 68? Anyway, I am your host, Pete Bickford, and I'm here for the next hour or so to answer your questions about all things ComicBase, comic-related, and so forth. We'll be getting into a little bit of industry news, some interesting things going on, and also talking a little bit about our Windows 11 experience. And if we have time, I think I might have had a bit of a brainwave, or at least a penny dropped after a number of years about superhero comics, and I wanted to share some thoughts on that. But the most important thing is I want to be able here to answer your questions. So please, if you go in the chat, if you could prefix your question with @ComicBaseTV, it helps it pop out so I can see it on this swarm of things that go whizzing by. It's a lot easier. Anyway, before we get into it, let's just make sure all the levels are working and things like that. So far, so good. Anyway, hey, Richard, nice to see you. Mike, Rob Weinberg, Xanadu Comics, great to see everyone. Oh, hey, from Seattle. And John Peace, Dave Stevens, Rocketeer, absolutely. Yeah, I'm sorry. We missed having. We actually approached Dave at one point about doing a cover for us for ComicBase, and it didn't come together in time. And then he died way too early, so I'm sad about that. But I'm happy to pay tribute to his work on this chat here. Hail, Agent DeCamp and Mike, and wow, let's get to it. All right, so I think we are good to go. Hopefully the audio levels are good for everyone. Turn them down just a little bit, but if it's too quiet, let me know. I can crank them down a little bit. It looked a little bit hot on my meters, so we'll take it from there. And anyway, so let's get to it. Jeff and Fred, nice to see everyone. Okay, let me see. Let me pull my show notes over so I can actually make some of the stuff out. First of all, before we get into the business of things, please like and subscribe if you haven't yet on the chat. In the YouTube, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification button, and particularly in the early moments of these things, it helps get the word out to everyone else out there. And definitely subscribe to the channel. I guess another couple subscribers, and we'll be at some magic threshold at which point certain magical things happen with YouTube. I don't know. I give you shiny new nickel or something. Anyway, hey, I hope everyone had a great Halloween. I gotta say, November is starting off really kind of fun for us around here, and it's we've got a bunch of stuff that we're going to be showing you really quickly, but I'm not going to go into it too much. But I'm at the point now, looking towards our new stuff here, that I'm getting just genuinely excited. It's just sort of like, I want to nail out a few wrinkles in the whole thing, but it's like, wow, this is really coming together. If I had a little more time on my hands, I'd have made up the A-Team cover with Hannibal, Smith with, it's like, I love it when a plan comes together. But did not have a chance to do that before the show, but you got the Rocketeer instead. So anyway, so let's see here. Yes, Hulk like smash button, absolutely. All right, so a couple of things I want to point your attention to. They're just happening in the world, and I thought they're worth giving some love to. Let's go to the other monitor here, and let's see how that goes. Yeah, so Image Comics workers have just unionized. This is something you don't see a lot of in this modern workday world of ours. You basically independent production assistants and whatnot have all gotten together. This is info's coming from the AV Club. It's a subsidiary of the guys over at Gizmodo and whatnot. I'm not sure what the parent media company is, but the statement on the behalf of Comic Book Workers United, which really is just Image Comics. But they hope, I think, to spread it to other things in the industry. We, the workers of Image Comics, have formed a union. For years, comic publishing workers have watched our professional efforts support creators and delight readers. Sadly, we've also reached the same labor be taken for granted at best and exploited at worst. Keeping our heads above water is the new normal before the pandemic, and since its onset, we have been expected to take on even larger workloads with fewer resources. My sympathy with you on that. Where my sympathy gets a little, more reserved is some of the concrete goals are, quote, a plan to address the overall lack of diversity in both general staff and management, continuation of remote work, pay for and workload transparency, as well as improved career mobility. Final goal proposes a collective voting action against creators who, quote, have found to have been engaged in abuse, sexual assault, racism and xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, ableism, etc., which could result in canceling their publication. So basically, they want to team up and censor creators they don't like. So, Yeah, at that point, my sympathies are out the frickin' window for you. I mean, dude, I don't get me wrong. I mean, it's a hard gig, being a low-paid artist, production assistant, writer, whatever else in any creative field. Um, I think what's happening over here is you've got a bunch of people who feel unappreciated in their current thing. They want better working conditions. Hey, who doesn't? I'm sympathetic as far as that goes. The part where you sit there and say, yeah, and we want to pressure our company in a way that makes you all woke and stuff like that. Otherwise, we're going to make sure that you pull other creatives' projects and deny them a platform to publish on. At that point, I'm not going to use profanity on the program, but go pound sand. I mean, you guys are just jerks at that point, and I hope they fire y'all. But other than that, I'm all down with it. No, it's just, guys, Image Comics. Let me say some nice things about Image Comics for a moment. I mean, back in 1992 or so, when they started out, it was a way for the underappreciated, very famous creators. From Todd McFarlane, Will Sportasio, Eric Larson, etc. All formed about the Image 7 went out, formed their own studios. They left a sure gig over at Marvel and DC, where they had a steady corporate paycheck. But they thought, what I've done with Spider-Man, I'll bet you I could do that with a new character like Spawn, and I'll bet you I could really make a company. I could really make a living for it. And they did spectacularly well for the most part, especially the ones who really had a good work ethic. I mean, ironically, some of the people who had the hardest time turning in work on time wound up actually also doing wonderful things for the industry, like Jim Valentino. Didn't really make a killing on his own steam, but he really opened up Image to other creatives. So you start seeing a resurgence. I mean, like you saw new work from Dave Sim from Cerebus, who would be enemy number one of the woke schools that seem to be forming up a thing over at Image right now, because of course he's politically incorrect as hell. Also one of the more important comic creators of the independent scene ever. He basically, if there's an independent comic creator unit going, it's because people like Dave Sim bucked everything that was going and really, beat that niche out of the industry. So, I mean, do you like his politics? No, you don't have to like his politics, but can you, not say, I appreciate what he did to make it so that all the rest of us can make a living on our own terms? Absolutely, he deserves the cred for that. But anyway, so I mean, the Image 7 went out, formed their own studios. Some of them became incredibly famous, incredibly rich off the whole thing. Jim Lee, strangely enough, founded Wildstorm, sold it back to DC Comics, took over DC Comics from within in the end. He's currently the last man standing who's really kind of an old school comics guy in that whole creative department. Everybody else is a media guy. But he did to DC Comics what Steve Jobs did when he came back to Apple. He was like that corporate acquisition who went up running the place. Anyway, that I think is laudatory and praiseworthy. I think the part where you let a lot of voices flourish. I love that Image Comics, when it started out, when Rob Liefeld was drawing impossible musculature. I mean, you'd have triceps, that were larger than people's heads, was a standard, figure work thing with Rob Liefeld. Just ridiculous stuff, but it got a fan reaction. It got him a fan base. Hated the storytelling, hated the art, but again, he was successful on some level. But I was thinking, God, if this is all the images, who cares? I mean, who needs another badly drawn, every page is a poster splash, so you can read the entire comic book in a minute and a half? Who needs that? But then people like Jim Valentino came in there, opened it up, and suddenly you had a lot of just great, Larry Martyr, I mean, Tales from the Beam World, but so many voices, including Robert Kirkman, Walking Dead and so forth, got their start at Image, because Image basically offered the creators a deal. It said, look, we'll act as your publisher. We'll do a certain amount of the scut work and the publicity, to extent, we'll publish you in the Diamond catalog and whatnot. We get a percentage of the publishing, and after we've taken our percent, the rest is all yours. We're going to respect you as a creator, just like we wanted to be respected when we left to form our own studio. That wound up being the magic sauce for, the secret sauce for just an explosion of creativity across the comics industry for the last 20-some years. And, the idea that a bunch of, disaffected hacks over in the copy production department at Image want to say, oh, no, we want to woke school you guys, and we want to gatekeep from within on who's allowed to publish as Image. again, go pound sand. I have no sympathy at all. So anyway, that's how I feel about that one. I'd be interested in your comments in the comments below. But anyway, let's talk about something else. Imaged all right, I'm gonna give a little bit of love here to a friend of mine. His name's Joel Meadows. He puts out a magazine called Tripwire periodically over in England. It is the best magazine in the comics industry. It's once upon a time we had Comics International, we had Comics Buyer's Guide, we had Wizard, we had the Comics Journal, if you like 10,000 word essays on why Jim Shooter is the devil. Anyway, we were flush with choice as comic readers as far as industry news, keeping up with creators, reading serious content about the comics industry. To now we have podcasts, and the only last remaining man in print that's worth a darn that I've seen is a magazine that comes out periodically called Tripwire over in England, helmed by Joel Meadows, a good friend of mine and just a good guy, and who does the work. He knows everybody, particularly in the British comic trades, everyone from Alan Moore to you name it, and he gets great interviews. He has great commentary, great movie reviews. He's done a lot of work for other magazines like Empire and things like that. He knows his stuff. Anyway, he's doing a Kickstarter, an Indiegogo campaign to launch a print special. And imagine that, a magazine that actually appears in print again in the year 2021. And I would definitely suggest have a look at it over on Indiegogo.com. I put the link in the show notes, and consider throwing Joel a couple bucks. In return, I guess they'll throw you copies of the magazine, T-shirts, whatever have you. I've definitely given, and consider it as well. I definitely encourage you to have a look. It's like, I think we have to support good journalism, and I think Tripwire is the best in the business that I've seen going, at least in a language I can read right now. I hear good things about certain Dutch magazines, but I can't read them, unfortunately. But anyway, give a look at that one and take it and move it on. All right, let's go back to the chat, see where we stand with everybody. Greg, I say anyone else get anything great for the collection since the last live stream? I'm going to say I picked up something kind of cool. This is Before Watchmen. I picked this up at Ollie's Discount Warehouse, which, if you guys have one of these in your area, those things are wonderful. I think I paid $22 for it. It's $125 cover price, and I've just been enjoying the hell out of it. It's every issue of all the prequel titles for Before Watchmen. Watchmen, of course, being the Citizen Kane of comic books. Before Watchmen is taking all the history and the characters that Alan Moore put together and running essentially their backstories and their world in, I believe they were a series of 4-issue miniseries, and they basically did one around all the major characters that were in Watchmen and the superhero group that came before. It was the Crime Busters, and I forget what the name of the other group that they didn't call themselves the Watchmen, but it was basically analogous in our world to Justice Society and the Justice League, if you can imagine that. And it's fascinating, the telling of this story. You've got great creators working on it: J. Michael Straczynski, Len Wein, just terrific stuff, and definitely worth looking into. So that was the best $22 I spent in a long time. So I hope you guys got something cool. All right, so let's see what else is going on. What's comic-based spoilers? I will give you a couple. Let me think about this for just a second. Let me talk about Windows 11 first, and we'll see how far we want to get. One problem I've got is I don't want to get people too excited about the next thing if the next thing is not shipping this very second, because all that really does is it makes people think, well, clearly I should put off whatever I'm thinking of doing until the next thing comes up. So I hope to whet your appetite with some of the stuff, but we'll be showing the more of the real thing in a very short period of time. Right now, let's talk about some other things. In particular, let's talk about Windows 11. All right, so let me switch monitors here again. So, all right, so This, of course, is just the backdrop I've got here. You might notice that there's a little bit less glare on my glasses from than usual, coming off the different monitors and stuff like that. I've got 3 different monitors staring at me in the face as I do these live streams, and a little bit less right now because all the powers that be of it, including us, have embraced dark modes in the things we're doing right now. So if you have a monitor in front of you, it's not basically acting as a ginormous lamp shining on your face, which, if you can read the monitor, means it's also shining right back into your glasses. Anyway, Windows 11 has embraced dark mode, but if I didn't tell you I was running Windows 11 and you didn't have just a great eye, let me move myself off of the monitor right now so you can actually even see it. If you didn't have just a great eye to see in my taskbar, you probably would never guess that I'm doing anything other than what I was doing exactly before. The icons are a little different. Most people are used to seeing them centered up. That's usually the giveaway that someone's using Windows 11. After trying it for about an hour or 2, I decided that that's the one feature of Windows 11 that is definitely worse than Windows 10, and I changed the taskbar settings so that the icons were pinned to the left-hand side like they were before. By the way, if you guys care about user interface type things or why it is that was so annoying to put them in the center, they got put in the center basically because Steve Jobs over at Apple put them in the center. He does things like that because he liked the look of it. And then I think that basically translated into, when Microsoft wanted to be cool, they put theirs in the center because, well, Steve Jobs had done it, so if Apple did it, it must be cool too. Let me move myself to the upper right-hand corner. That might be a little bit more useful for what we're doing here. From a tactical level, from a usability level, this actually gets into more, if you guys know the terminology of the whole thing, you say usability is how easy something is to use. You hear that the old-fashioned term is human interface. It comes from the idea of that there's a machine-to-machine interface, the way when computers are talking to each other. That's a machine-machine interface. When a human is trying to operate the machine, that he uses what's called the human interface. It's how the human commands the machine around. Human-to-human interface is us talking to each other. Anyway, the newer term for human interface then became user interface, and then more grandly these days became user experience, and the people who design them these days like to call themselves experience designers, because it isn't that we're just designing like the buttons and the gizmos on screen that let you interface. No, we're in control of the entire experience of using the computer, which is a bit grand. It's true, but it's a bit grand, I'll admit, as someone who's even in this field. But before you got into that stuff, there was an older field called human factors, which is concerned with the idea not of just how do I move a machine around, but how do I just, as a human being, what are the mechanics of being human that work well when operating objects? And so a human factors specialist will be concerned with if I'm looking at the top of this punch tab here on my Sunkist here, how much of a grip do I have to be able to do to stick the average human finger underneath it in order to exert how much of a bursting force on this can over here in order to actually open the thing successfully. When you're talking about like things like, if I'm designing the doorways for a building, you have interest in what's the average human height, but also what's the maximum likely human height, because you don't want to make every doorway be at the average human height or a couple inches above, because what happens when you guy's a little bit taller? You don't want to bash his head in. But there's no point having doorways that are 10 feet tall. Even there was one guy in the history of the world who was 9 foot something or other. You don't make things for him either, but you do actually get concerned with the idea of just there are certain abilities we've got as humans, just the bioware of what we do, that has to be able to fit the objects in our life at a certain extent, and to the extent that computers deal with that, how do we do it well? Well, one of the things that comes into this one is the idea of a menu bar, and this is an interesting one because the thing that governs, there's actually a law, one of the few bits of hard science that's involved in human factors, is a thing called Fitts' law, which says that the time required to acquire a target, and in other words, for me to say hit this mouse target with my mouse, is a function of two things. One is how big is the target, how big is that icon, and how far away is my mouse, right? So if my mouse is way over here, it takes me longer to get there than if my mouse is right there, right? That makes complete sense. It also means that if this mouse icon were 10 times the size, it'd be easier for me to whap the mouse over there and hit it. All right, so why do we care about Fitts' law when it comes to menu bars on Windows, systems? Because there's an interesting thing that goes on with that one, in that menu bars are pinned. In other words, if you watch my mouse cursor, and here I'm really asking for a lot here, but if we watch the mouse cursor and we zoom down to the bottom here, as soon as I hit the bottom, the mouse doesn't go any further. It pegs out at the end there. So I mean, every pixel that I move, with every micrometer I move with my finger moves a certain amount of pixels down here. But as soon as I hit the edge where the menu bar is, then suddenly none of those movements make any impact whatsoever. The mouse basically stays pinned to the bottom of the whole thing. So as a result, if you sit there and say, how big is the target for a menu bar? Well, the answer is, in the direction it's pinned, it's 70 miles tall. It's infinitely tall, which means, if I've got a mouse and I'm going to move it down to the part here, this is an infinitely large target, which means I can do stuff very, very quickly. All right. Well, that works up and down right now for the Windows taskbar. When it was pinned to the left-hand side, the way that, Fitts and God intended it, it also meant that along the left-hand side, it was also infinitely wide, right? Which means that the thing at the bottom left-hand corner, ground zero of your screen, if I just whap the mouse over there, I'm going to wind up right on top of it, unless you've got two monitors like I do. But for everybody else, if I just, whatever gross movement I do to get down there is going to wind up putting your mouse at the most important place on the screen, which is to say the Windows bar. At which point, I've got a nice mental anchoring point for every other icon on my screen as I move left and right, and I can remember the position of things as I move left and right. All right, so then, okay, what had happened when Windows did this? And the default Windows setting, let me see if I can pull it over to the window so it's the same screen so we can see it. Taskbar behavior, taskbar alignment. So the default for the taskbar in Windows 11 is this. It's centered. So what happened to I can just nail the mouse to the left and get somewhere? I can't. I have to kind of steer around there. Okay, and now this Windows icon is now just one icon amongst any. The icons to the right of it are now an arbitrary distance from where it was, depending on the size of my screen and how many apps I have open and things like that. And I'm constantly having to essentially reread my screen to figure out how to get to any particular icon. It's a decidedly inferior design, and you can prove it with actual science for once. It isn't just a preference. I mean, you may like it you may think, well, yeah, it's harder to use, but it's pretty, so I like it. I mean, that's justifiable at least. But if you sit there on a pure usability standpoint, you say, was it a better design? No, it's a worse design. And so why they do it? Because Apple had done it first. And before we get too far into the whole idea of Apple, it's like Steve Jobs. I knew him slightly. I have great respect for the man. He did a number of amazing things for the world. But it cannot be forgotten. Also, he did a lot of dumb stuff too. The same guy who gave us, beautiful, elegant typography, on the Apple and Retina screens and all this gorgeous sense of style brought to computers, is the same guy who gave us the hockey puck mouse. Something where, if you're talking about human factors, it's like, here is my hand. Here is a modern mouse. The hand conforms to the mouse, parameters, in, again, a fairly human factory kind of way. But for whatever reasons that Steve liked at the moment when he came and did his thing, when he came back to Apple, he thought, circles are nice objects. They don't look much like hands, but yeah, I will do a mouse in the shape of a barely contoured hockey puck, and that'll be my mouse. Everyone else on the planet had been doing mice that you could comfortably rest a human hand on top of and operate buttons with. But he's like, no, it doesn't look as cool. So he did that. So yeah, the same thing that got us that also got us the the centered up bar for taskbars and so forth. As Windows was trying to copy all the nicer things about it, about Windows style, they also copied a couple of clunkers, and that's one of them. So other than that, things that you will see everywhere in Windows, and again, we have a dark mode. The dark mode works very well, especially we have customers that, there are various reasons why having a lot of light coming at you might be harder on your eyes, particularly older eyes, glaucoma, anything like that. But also just sometimes your eyes just get tired. It's just just an eye strain thing. The big things they copied while they're at it, they rounded up all the corners here. That's the other big feature that gives everything away here in Windows 11 is the rounded corners on everything. And by the way, we have been able to verify that yes, you can run ComicBase on Windows 11. Matter of fact, I was running it there just a second ago. Let me go and pop it up. And yeah, when we go and we open up anything you like, you'll see that. Whoops, let me bring it over to the right window. You'll see that, all of our corners are rounded just like everybody else's. The color scheme adopted the Windows 11 color schemes. They changed the look of checkboxes and several other things. They made things like the buttons very subtle these days. They've got nice highlighting to them and so forth, but a lot of very just subtle aesthetic changes to the whole thing. Strange enough, they did basically bupkis with the drop downs, but the buttons and the checkboxes and the radio buttons all look nicer. The window behaviors are largely the same. They have some nice new snap behaviors. So if you want to lay out a bunch of windows next to each other, it does some nice good stuff with that. And definitely, if you've got Windows 11, I do encourage you to look through the list of Windows shortcut keys that came with it, because there's a bunch of new stuff for laying out your windows along different metrics and so forth. So for instance, if I want to take this guy over here, and it'll say like, well, let's put let's put our Tripwire window just to the side of it. It'll nicely slide these things to each other. This is a 1x1. They also have formats that are basically a 3-column, 1-column over there. They have 2 thin columns on the left and right, and a large column on and down the middle and so forth. They have all sorts of different over and under layouts and so forth. They're all now standard layouts. So worth looking into. Some of them actually will make a difference. Other things, they're kind of cool. They brought back widgets. So to the extent that you like this sort of thing, by the way, the thing that brought that up for me right now is Windows W. So let's see if I can pull up the overhead camera, if that's a good idea or not. Yeah, so Windows and then W. We'll show and hide the Windows widget on that guy. And you can do things like, here's the sports scores, here's the weather, and so forth. One thing that's kind of interesting on this one is they preloaded the widgets with news sources, and you can add all sorts of things. Like you can add your own widgets to do any number of things. You're not allowed to get rid of the news widget unless you just uninstall it. And as a result, you're going to wind up sucking down news from news sources that Microsoft thinks are good for you. So I don't know if you're a NBC or a CNN fan or an ABC fan or a BBC fan, but Microsoft sure is. And so whether you want it to or not, that is going to definitely be just when you're just kind of catching the sports scores and things like that. That'll kind of be a view of the world that they are going to foist upon you unless you go to some effort to not do that. And it's interesting that they allow you to customize widgets. Like, let's say, hey, I don't mind seeing the sports, or I don't mind seeing my stock. I really don't want to see the headlines. It takes me away from my work day. If you feel that way, you can't get rid of it unless you literally uninstall it. And that's just, I don't know. I'm going to say that Big Tech has earned enough distrust from me in the last year that I'm not sure if I trust that their motives are pure. So, you may feel good or bad about that or not. We'll see. Speaking of widgets, we are considering doing a ComicBase and/or Atomic Avenue widget. Please, in the chat or by writing me at support@comicbase.com, let us know what you'd want to see in a widget. They look pretty easy to put together, honestly. They're largely web-based types of things that can use interfaces we've already got. So, obvious things are like if you sell on Atomic Avenue or you're using ComicBase, you might want to know like hey, what's the do you want to see like how your collection value is changing over the last several weeks? We could potentially put that graph of your value into the widget. We could tell you when new updates are available for the program. We could tell you when you've sold things. That goes for both ComicBase and Atomic Avenue, and so forth. So let us know what sorts of things, if you first of all, if you're using Windows 11, if you would like to see a widget, period, and maybe you have no interest whatsoever. But if you have interest, let us know what sorts of things you'd be interested in having us throw together, because this is one of these things that like we could probably throw together as just like an offline project, not necessarily tied to anything in the program or the websites themselves, and just throw it out there for the people who like it. So yeah, let us know. Other than that, performance-wise, it's hard to say whether or not. Originally I'd done a quick test of like file copies, game performance and things like that, and I thought I saw some kind of difference, but it didn't hold up. There is some interesting caching going on with the disk operating systems and the way it loads, which could give you some bumps on things at least near term, so it could feel a little faster, even though if you're doing lots of real work all in a row, it all winds up being basically identical to Windows 10 in terms of the performance. Stability seems fine. I haven't had any problems with it at all. The only biggest problem I had with it is getting started. Windows Update is finally after weeks of me whining about it, had finally said, hey, Windows Update is available to install. Go ahead and install it. It got up to 8% on the install about 20 different times after any number of restarts and closing programs and trying this, that, and the other thing, and just never got past it. In the end, I wound up just having to go to the Microsoft site itself, and you can find, there's a link in there someplace that allows you to just download Windows 11. And if you just downloaded it yourself, then you could install it, and there was no problem with that at all. It took about an hour, all things considered. It was smooth. It was basically like installing Windows 10. I haven't seen any problems with compatibility for programs I use. One thing that's a little odd, and this kind of goes into the category of change for change's sake, and not necessarily good, is let's say I go and let's say I wanted to compress this folder, the ComicBase TV folder. What I would typically do in the past is I would right click on this, and I would go, and there'd be a 7-zip menu because I'd installed 7-zip, and I'd be able to just compress it. What they've done though is they've built, when you right click nowadays, is they felt like that window that that people were using, the context window, was getting the menu was getting a little long, and so what they did is they said, well, we'll have our 7 or 8 approved items that we think that people will want to do with things, and then we'll make you go an extra click to see the things that aren't that. And of the approved items, there's open it. Okay, fine, fair enough. Open it in a new window. Yeah, okay, I guess. Pin it or unpin it from quick access. Compress to a zip file. Okay, that's pretty handy. Yeah, except I don't use zip so much. I use 7-zip mostly. Copy as path. Okay, that's getting a little obscure. Properties. Okay, we use that one a lot. That's probably the number one thing I do when I am looking at something in the context menu. And they gave that a nice Alt-Enter shortcut. I guess it existed before, but I never knew it. Open in Windows Terminal. I gotta say, 99% of users will use that exactly 0 times in their life. Because I guess if you really, really wanted a command line version to get to a particular thing, well, I guess that's the thing. But I gotta think this is of way more interest to Microsoft's programmers than it is to almost anyone else. But then for everyone else, show more options. And show more options simply gives you back the menu that was there before, plus a bunch of other stuff they stuck to the top. But if I want to say view, add it to the VLC player, Roxio Genie is a program we use for, for burning disks and so forth. Here's 7-zip, which I would have done things. There was my Dropbox, all these different programs that you use on a day-to-day basis. They basically just made them one more click away, which isn't actually helping me any, and I wish there was a way to defeat that. I'm going to say that's another thing where, like, it was change for change's sake largely, and it not in a way that helped anything in the world. One thing I would have loved to hear that they've done with Windows 11, and I can't confirm that they've done anything at all on it, is you'll see out here a lot of these icons over here these are called shell notification icons. They have little badges attached to them. In this case, the ones that are in green are ones that have been backed up into our source control system. ComicBase 2021, we just made a change in that file, and we hadn't checked it in yet, so that's why it's showing that, you know, you need to do something with it. But if you guys use Dropbox or OneDrive or any of the countless other programs on there, you'll notice that they're always fighting each other for access to the shell icons, because whoever designed Windows thought, you know, I guess it's a number like 16, but it's a number certainly no bigger than that, is as big a number as anyone ever needs to show icons attached to files. And as people start doing things like file syncing over, you know, Dropboxes and multiple services could, you know, want to fight the same ones, source code check-ins, managing accounts, so forth. Everyone's fighting for the same, you know, all these services want about 7 of those icons for themselves minimum to say whether or not it's syncing, whether it has been synced, whether there's a conflict with the sync, whether it's checked in, whether it's not checked in, and so forth. And as a result, you're constantly running out of icons. And so you have to go to elaborate things in regedit in order to make it so that, okay, it's more important for me to see which source code has been checked in, and so I'm going to rearrange the icons in my registry to say, matter of fact, I think it's probably so frequently used, I could probably even pull it up really. No, I won't do it right now. But anyway, you wind up going to these tremendous games, which unfortunately everyone's known about since about Windows 95, in order to make all these shell icons work. And I've not heard anything at all as to whether or not Microsoft freed that up or not. If they had freed that up so you can have infinite numbers of shell icons, then that would actually be something useful. But if not, then who cares? Anyway, that's my initial impressions of Windows 11. Be curious to see what yours were. Yeah, I gotta say, I was much more excited about getting Windows 11 until I got it. At which point it was kind of like, you know, it's there. It's not really worse, but it's not really better either. They changed around the location of a bunch of things. I can't say that the new things make a lot more sense than the old ways. It's just new things to learn for no apparent reason. You know, I like the aesthetics of it a little better. But it's hard to say it's a win. You know, at least not a very clear win. I guess I'm gonna have to join PC World with their impression of it, which says, yeah, it's basically kind of a B minus. Yeah, maybe it's a B. You know, but B minus, I'd say is about where it comes to from a value standpoint. I wish I could say that there was something under the covers like, oh yeah, as soon as I did this, everything about X got way more stable or way faster or way more something. Instead, it just seems more like change for change's sake. So, yeah, you know, it marks a roadmap, and that's probably the reason that they called it Windows 11 and not Windows 21H2 or something like that, because Microsoft likes having a new operating system about every 7 years, and they like retiring the old ones. And it's been 7 years since Windows 10 came out, and I think they need to start laying down the marker that says, yeah, in a while, anything called Windows 10 anything won't be supported anymore, and so we need to have a clear dividing point. Whereas beforehand, the idea of an ever-living Windows 10 ecosystem, which again was copied from Apple's idea of there's OS 10 or OS X, and it just comes through various national parks and big cat names to try to distinguish one very nearly identical version from the other. It's turned into a little bit of a maintenance nightmare for both companies in terms of knowing, well, how do I know that my Mac of a certain vintage can or can't run OS 10 version 10.15 or 10.13 as opposed to 10.12? And the answer is, after a while, it's like anything you have to differentiate in the decimal is not going to be something most users grok onto. And so I think they wanted to just throw a line down the sand and say, yeah, this is 11. It's the next big one. And so it gives an excuse to say that this is when this epoch ended and the new one began. I think it also gave them an excuse to sell, obviously, new software, because even though you've got Windows 10, you're going to get a free upgrade to 11. There are definitely machines and things like that where, unless you've got a processor that was built in the last couple generations, it just won't run Windows 11. And you will be able to see in kind of a visible way that you're not keeping up, and it'll encourage you to actually go and spend for both new machines and also very much tied into that new Windows licenses. I don't think that that's far from their minds as well. And to a little bit on the security end of things, there is all the nonsense with the trusted platform module, the TPM 2.0 requirement, which, as far as it goes, I think is legit, but I think it's pretty weak sauce for most users. So I'd say if you've got a machine that's running just fine on Windows 10, don't freak. You're not in a different place than you were before Windows 11 came out. But I do think Microsoft wanted to throw down a gauntlet which says, yeah, and on your next machine, make sure it's got Windows 11 on it, which means it's of a newer vintage. It's got a newer processor. It's got some newer hardware support for the things they want to do in the future. And so you'll be in a better position to move forward for the next 5-10 years with your machine. Although why anyone would want to keep a machine for 10 years is beyond me. But anyway, that is my extended Windows 11 gripe. Let me check the chat because I've been talking for quite a while. All right, let's see here. Online store. Yeah, a question about Ollie's came up. So Ollie's Bargain Warehouse. Let me turn off my bit here so we can see the channel whole thing. Jesse Comics asked, does Ollie's have an online store? Not to my knowledge. They have a website where you can get coupons and things like that. Straight up, it's a little bit of a grim store in terms of most of the stuff there. It's the kind of thing where, like, if you're pretty tight up for money, it's kind of like the Kmart Blue Light specials for most of the store. The grand exception to all of that is the books and the comic books. I mean, there isn't a lot that I would find particularly compelling in, like, say, the housewares or, whatever kind of jank leftover, candy bars they've got going on in aisle 7 or something. But when you get into the books, the graphic novels, and so forth, you're in a world where, like, wait, this is like Crown Books, if you guys remember that, brought to life in the current day. And the graphic novel deals are just off the hook. I mean, you're talking about 20%, if anything, for what you're going to pay for basically remaindered graphic novels. But you know what? We'll take them. Because if they're in good shape, they ain't selling, you'll sell them to me for 20 cents on the dollar. I will buy a great many of them. So, yeah, worth looking into. All right, let's see here. Mike Beam. Okay, so Gregory accidentally asked a question. Let me read this. One point the passage said there is don't technically Scotia Comics and book the Marvel Universe got fired out as comics. Yeah, so the gist of it is the official handbook of the Marvel Universe, etc. The question really comes down to a question of what is a comic book versus what is a magazine or a book. And originally, when we comic-based history, up until about 2-3 years ago, everything was that we had in there we listed as a comic book, whether it was anything at all, because all we had was comic books. When we did ComicBase 2020, suddenly we added new categories for books and magazines, and we spent a fair amount of time moving things like, Playboy magazine is clearly a magazine, it's not a comic book. But then also things like, the fanzines, Aliens magazine, so forth. All those things moved into magazines as well, and a lot of art portfolio books, the art of Arthur Sidum, the art of whoever else, they all got moved into books because they contained no graphic stories. And when we were doing all this stuff, the awkward part is there's a little bit of tension between the definition of what forms a comic book. A comic book basically has to be, it has to be a story told with a juxtaposition of graphics and words on the page. In other words, it can't just be an illustration accompanying a big block of text. That would be an illustrated storybook, right? It has to involve the juxtaposition of the graphic image in the storytelling innately. But it comes down very close to Scott McCloud's definition of it from understanding comic books. When it didn't follow that, we still had a problem with a number of things that were just reference manuals, like the Iron Manual, which is nothing but an illustration of various Iron Man armor, along with lots and lots of text which explains the different weapon systems on it. It was published in something that looked a lot like a comic book. I mean, it was floppy cover. It was sold for about comic booky prices. The trim size fit in a standard comic bag. And I'll admit, we got a little wobbly about, it was in comics, but we moved it to magazines, but then you yelled at us, so we moved it back. And it's like, yeah, a couple of these things we we went back and forth on a little bit, and I'm gonna take the hit on that one for saying we should not have wobbled. The big reason that we have to enforce the definition of a comic book is something that tells a story with a juxtaposition of words and images like that. Among other things, I did give my word to a customer who has, as it turns out, the Guinness World's Record for the largest comic book collection. And talking to him about 6 or 7 years ago when I was over at his house, and he's showing me this amazing comic collection, and we talked about where we'd like to see the program go in future years. We were having a long talk. He was being very kind. I said, well, I'd love to do a Guinness count, because when he won the Guinness Book of World Records record, part of, if I want the world record for, opening boxes with a box cutter, whatever the thing is that you're going to get a Guinness Book of World Records for, step one is they get a bunch of judges, and they agree on, well, what constitutes the thing that you're trying to get the world record in. And the Guinness judges, which by the way, it turns out the Guinness judges, it is actually an offshoot of the Guinness Brewing Company. It started out with a bunch of the owners of the Guinness Brewing Company sitting around, I believe they were grouse hunting or something like that, and they were just having one of those discussions we have as we're out grouse hunting, about like, well, I wonder what the largest flock of grouse has ever been, whatever the thing was that you'd be gabbing on about all day long. But then you think, as sportsmen, how would we decide this? And that eventually became the publishing arm, which then became the Guinness Book of World Records, publishers. But anyway, when someone sat there and said, look, I think I have the world's largest comic collection. Now, on one hand, I'd be sitting there going like, well, you don't, because I personally have several customers who have like multiple millions of comic books. But the people at Guinness had decided that no, for it to count as a comic book for a Guinness Book of World Records thing, it has to be, if you have, it has to be a certain type of book, and they basically came up with the idea of it has to be, words juxtaposed with images in the telling of a story. It isn't, it wasn't, whether it had word balloons, it wasn't whether it had thought bubbles, it wasn't, it was literally the form of the comic story had to be present in the whole thing, and that had to be its primary source of content. So in other words, if you had one big magazine that was nothing but the sports stories, but they happened to run a comic strip in the middle, that whole thing would still not count as a comic book. It didn't matter what size it was. There's all sorts of different trim sizes and things like that, but that was the key thing. Anyway, when I was telling this customer, I was telling him years and years ago, before we even really started working on ComicBase 2020, I said, well, yeah, I'd love to make it so we could have a Guinness count, not just for you, but anyone else who wanted to play, where you could get a count of your comic books that qualified under the Guinness rules. For what counts as a comic book. And one of the other things that counts as a comic book is if I have 5 million copies of the same issue, like one of my customers has so many copies of Spawn versus Batman and Batman Spawn that we had to increase the number type that we use to designate it from from a signed integer, which has a maximum magnitude of 32,768, I believe. He had like 45,000 copies of a single comic book. Anyway, we at one point in the dim past, we had to actually increase things just for him. But it turns out, under Guinness rules, that would count as you have one copy, because you have Spawn versus Batman. The fact that you have a lot of copies of Spawn versus Batman doesn't give you any extra bragging rights. So that is the definition of ComicBase, of a comic book in ComicBase, needs to hew to the Guinness definition, if for no other reason than I gave my word. And I think it's a good definition anyway, but I gave my specific word on that one. Now, when you get into, is this a magazine versus book, we have the idea of, well, was it published, according to any kind of periodical schedule, which is generally how that is defined. But then you can say, well, what about irregularly published magazines? I do think there's some gray area that we'll be knocking out some edge cases on this one as it goes. But that is why when recently it was called to my attention that the Guides to the Marvel Universe had slid back into comic books because they were largely comic book size. There were some large later ones that were loose leaf size that were easier to want to exclude. But that's why they got bumped back in the end. And I am probably going to be a jerk and hew to that definition in terms of classing things as comic books in the future. Because once again, gave my word. What am I going to do? Sorry, that is the long answer to that question, and way more history of Guinness than you ever needed to know. All right, so, and I'm going to have to read everyone's comments later on about the whole thing. Steve Dazinger wants to remind everybody as well, for Gary, for Windows 11, for secure boot, your boot drive has to be formatted as GPT, not MBR. GPT is Global Partition Table, I think. MBR is Master Boot Record. It basically refers to, on your disk, there's a little sector. There's either a file or there's a little partition on it that tells it how to use the rest of the disk. And there's two different schemes that have come by over the years. The more modern one is GPT. If you are setting up a new computer or you need to format a drive and install it under, when you're asked, do you want to format this as a GPT driver or as an MBR, say GPT. Just think the G stands for good. It doesn't really, but that's how they have it. Okay. Okay, Fred says, "Hey Pete, now explain how the books category has types of comic book and single issue magazine." I can't. I don't think it should. So some things, when you're transferring the issues from one to the other, if you said, for instance, that when you transfer a trade paperback over to a comic book, so you transfer the item type, it has to start by taking the item type from the one and slamming it into the other category. That doesn't mean it's our official designation for it. Some of the stuff is just detritus from the act of slamming it in and probably needs to be cleaned up by us a little bit. I noticed, for instance, that what was it? The binding item types, it becomes binding types when you refer to a book. And so there are certain things that were comic books in the past where you would refer to them as the hardcover edition of a comic book. So it might be called Book 1/HC would be it as a comic book. And then we realized, well, wait, this is nothing more than an artist portfolio. It really should have been classed as a book. And if we weren't really on our game and we were asleep at the wheel a little bit, that thing would then become 1/HC, just item number 1, or maybe just 8/HC. But then its binding type would be hardcover, and so you might wind up with a hardcover whose variation was hardcover. That's nonsense, and that's a mistake, and we need to fish those out and fix them. And if you see them, please call them to our attention. If there are any books that are classed as comic book, let us know. We should take them out of there and call them something else. This is some of the growing pains as we move into these other areas, and we're converting existing stock from one place to another. And honestly, with about 1 million items in the database, actually there's over 1 million items in the database now, we're gonna screw up some stuff. And when we do, the thing we can do is we can fix it as fast as possible and hopefully not break it again. So that's where we are. Okay, so let's see here. Let's see. So what is the bottom line on my question? Do we move OHOTMU to magazines or remove it back to comic books? The answer is leave it. It's in magazines. That is the bottom line on that one. Okay. Let's see here. And then answer a question about chat. Okay, I think I might have hit things. I'm just doing a quick scan of the comments, but I think we largely got it. It is 4:53, and for once in my life, I'm actually going to finish this out a little quickly, unless anyone has a last-minute question for me. I'm going to save my thoughts on superheroes for later, because actually, when I was thinking about it, it made for a better discussion, at least with the people I brought it up with, the chat, just to see if you're crazy. That I thought it might be like just a themed live stream, maybe come next week on that one. But it's cool. It's it's one of those things, like, you guys have ever heard the expression "the penny dropped," which what it comes from is it comes from really old style payphones, which if you're talking about the penny dropping as opposed to dropping a dime, it's the same idea, but it used to be with like World War II era telephone equipment. You would basically put your money in like a little cage, at the top of the phone, and it would try to contact the person, and if the call connected, then what would happen is it would complete a circuit, it would open a door, and the dime or the penny or whatever else would go into a cash box, and you'd never see it again. If the call didn't connect, you could turn up your receiver, press the coin back, and it would disperse the thing back to you. So when you talk about things like I dropped a dime on this guy, what that means is I went to a phone booth, stuck in a dime. I made the call to the police or whoever was I was ratting him out to, and then the dime dropped. The call was completed. I was done. We talk about penny dropping, which probably dates way back. As far as I know, it's the same idea. Is that you've had something jangling around your head, it's ringing around there, and at some point, boom, the connection was made, and then the penny drops. So you actually put it there. But yeah, I actually had one of those moments finally after about 20 years about the nature of superhero comics. So I think I'll talk about it next time if we don't have more important things to talk about, like your questions. So anyway, guys, thank you for joining us. This has been fun, and let's see you again next week, and we'll take it from there. Anyway, and I think that'll do it. All right, guys, take care. Bye-bye.